The war had scorched 92 star systems when Queen Virexxa's armor began to scream. Not audibly, the exosuit didn't possess vocal cords, but through the psychic link that bound her nervous system to the biomechanical plating. Every warrior of the Kryll Dominion knew their armor as intimately as their own heartbeat. Virexxa had worn hers for 17 cycles. Through campaigns that had reduced worlds to ash and turned rebellions into cautionary tales. The symbiotic plating responded to her thoughts before she could articulate them, shifted its molecular structure to deflect plasma fire, and hummed with her rage during battle. But now, in the command chamber of her flagship, as holographic star charts flickered around her, the armor convulsed with wrongness. She felt it in her secondary spine, a cascade of system failures rippling through the exosuit's neural pathways. The left shoulder plate went dark, the energy distribution network collapsed. Her officers backed away as violet sparks danced across her chest piece. And for the first time in her military career, Virexxa experienced something foreign: vulnerability. Then, just as suddenly, the armor stabilized. The neural link surged back to full capacity, stronger than before. Diagnostic glyphs scrolled across her vision, each one confirming optimal functionality. But Virexxa didn't celebrate. She stood motionless, her four eyes narrowing as she ran her clawed fingers along the shoulder plate. Something had changed. The resonance frequency was different, subtle, nearly imperceptible, but different. She summoned her chief technician, a grizzled Kryll named Vex who had maintained royal armor for 3 generations. He scanned the exosuit with trembling instruments, his antenna flattening against his skull as the readings populated his datapad. The repairs were flawless, he reported, more sophisticated than anything their own engineers could achieve. But buried in the code, hidden beneath layers of encryption, were signatures. Human signatures. 37 light-years away, in a forgotten orbital station that clung to a dying moon like a parasite, Marcus Webb was trying to forget he existed. The outpost had been abandoned during humanity's retreat from the Outer Rim, left adrift in the gravitational shadow of a gas giant that churned perpetually in shades of rust and amber. Webb had chosen this exile deliberately, after his own people had branded him a traitor for reverse engineering Kryll technology. They called it espionage. He called it understanding, the desperate attempt to comprehend the enemy that was systematically erasing humanity from the galaxy. The charges had been formal: unauthorized access to alien systems, modification of captured equipment, endangering human security through technological fraternization. The sentence had been informal but absolute: disappear or face execution. So he'd taken this station, stocked it with salvaged equipment and stolen data cores, and spent his days in the gray space between species. His workshop was a chaos of floating tools, dissected alien tech, and cascading holographic code. Webb didn't sleep much anymore. When he did, he dreamed in binary. The first sign of trouble was the proximity alarm, a sound Webb hadn't heard in 4 years. His coffee drifted away as he scrambled to the sensor array, his augmented eyes processing the data faster than his conscious mind could follow. A Kryll warship had just dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. Not a patrol vessel, not a scout. A dreadnought-class command ship, the kind reserved for royalty or planetary sieges. Webb's hands moved across the controls, routing all power to life support and passive systems, killing every electronic signature that might betray his presence. But even as he worked, he knew it was futile. They weren't scanning for random debris. They were coming for him. The ship's trajectory was too precise, too deliberate. Somehow, impossibly, they knew he was here. Webb allowed himself one moment of bitter laughter. After years of invisibility, his greatest work had betrayed him. He'd been so careful, so meticulous, embedding his fixes in quantum subroutines that would dissolve after implementation. But he'd underestimated Kryll paranoia, or perhaps overestimated his own cleverness. Virexxa materialized in Webb's workshop, via personal teleporter privilege of rank that bypassed all conventional security. She appeared in full armor, her massive frame filling the narrow corridor. Her presence so overwhelming that the station's artificial gravity seemed to bend around her. Webb didn't run. There was nowhere to go. Instead, he remained at his workstation, his fingers still dancing across holographic interfaces, completing a subroutine that no longer mattered. The Queen approached slowly, each footfall resonating through the deck plating. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that human ears weren't designed to process. But Webb's translator implant rendered it in cold, precise English. She asked him the question that had driven her across star systems: who gave him the authority to touch her armor? to infiltrate the most sacred technology of her people, to presume he could improve upon Kryll perfection. Webb turned to face her then, and Virexxa saw something unexpected in his eyes, not fear, but exhaustion. The kind of weariness that comes from carrying impossible knowledge alone. Webb explained in the flat tone of someone who no longer cared about consequences. He'd intercepted the Kryll military network 3 months ago, while monitoring their fleet movements. Standard reconnaissance, the kind that had kept him alive this long. But he'd found something anomalous. A hidden data stream originating from within the Queen's own flagship, targeting her armor's core systems. At first, he'd dismissed it as standard maintenance protocols. Then he decoded the payload. It was a nanoplague sophisticated patient, designed to corrupt the symbiotic bond between Kryll warrior and exosuit. Over the course of months, the symptoms would appear as natural degradation, age-related decline. Nothing that would raise suspicion until the armor failed catastrophically in battle. Someone close to Virexxa, someone with access to royal systems, wanted her dead. Webb had traced the origin point to her own strategic council. He'd pulled the files, seen the conspiracy coded in encrypted meeting logs, and diverted resources. They were planning a coup, and the Queen's death in battle would be their catalyst. Virexxa remained motionless as Webb continued, his words tumbling out with the urgency of confession. He'd faced a choice, he said. Let the conspiracy unfold after all. The Kryll were the enemy. And Virexxa herself had ordered the bombardment of 12 human colonies. Her death might fracture the Dominion, buy humanity precious time. But Webb had spent too many years studying Kryll technology, too many sleepless nights mapping the elegant brutality of their systems. He understood something that most humans refused to accept. The Kryll weren't monsters. They were people, with their own codes and contradictions. And the conspiracy he'd uncovered wasn't just about removing one leader. The coup faction intended to escalate the war beyond any previous threshold. To deploy planet-killing weapons that would render entire systems uninhabitable. Their internal communications referenced humanity not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a contamination to be sterilized. If they succeeded, if Virexxa fell, the moderate voices in the Kryll hierarchy would fall with her. The war would become an extinction event. So Webb had made his decision in the isolation of his exile, with no one to consult and nothing to gain. He'd hacked into the quantum communication stream during a fleet relay, injected his repair code into the armor's diagnostic cycle, and prayed his fixes would hold long enough for the Queen to notice. He'd embedded his signature deliberately, a desperate gambit to force this exact confrontation. Because Virexxa needed to know. Someone had to warn her. And Webb, the traitor to his species, the ghost in a forgotten station, was the only one who could. He finished his explanation and waited. His augmented heart rate finally spiking as his body caught up to his mind's acceptance of death. Virexxa could kill him with a thought. The armor's offensive systems included 17 ways to end a human life, each more efficient than the last. Instead, she asked him a question that fractured the moment into something neither of them expected. She asked him to prove it. Webb moved through his workshop with renewed purpose, pulling data cores from hidden compartments and routing them through his main display. Holographic evidence materialized between them, intercepted communications, financial records showing diverted military funds, schematic overlays of the nanoplague embedded in Virexxa's armor systems. He showed her the conspiracy in all its meticulous detail, watched her 4 eyes widen as she recognized the signatures of her most trusted advisors. Then he did something that sealed his fate or saved it, he couldn't tell which. He showed her the human equivalent. Files from his own trial, evidence of how his people had condemned him for trying to understand rather than simply destroy. Parallel conspiracies. Parallel betrayals. Webb explained that he'd learned something during his exile. Something that both species seemed determined to ignore. The war wasn't sustainable. The Kryll Dominion and the Human Confederation were locked in a death spiral. Each escalation feeding the next. Both civilizations hemorrhaging resources into a conflict that would leave the galaxy empty of either species. The moderates on both sides were being systematically silenced, replaced by fanatics who saw compromise as weakness. Virexxa processed this information with the cold calculation of a military commander, but Webb could see something shifting in her posture. The armor's bioindicators, visible to his augmented vision, showed emotional turbulence, uncertainty, anger, and something that might have been recognition. She asked him what he wanted, not what humanity wanted, not what his government might demand, but what he, Marcus Webb, personally sought from this encounter. It was the first time in 4 years anyone had asked him that question. Webb looked at the alien queen standing in his workshop, at the evidence floating between them, At the vast darkness beyond the station's viewports, he told her the truth. He wanted to stop being alone. The isolation had seemed noble at first, necessary even, but it had become its own kind of death. He wanted to matter again, to use his skills for something beyond survival. If she was willing, if the conspiracy they'd uncovered represented an opportunity rather than just a threat, maybe they could work together. Not as allies, that would be absurd, but as two people who'd seen behind their respective curtains and couldn't unsee the machinery. The silence that followed felt geological in its weight. Virexxa's armor hummed softly, processing her biological responses as she made the kind of decision that would ripple through history. She told Webb that accepting his help would be seen as weakness by her court, that trusting a human would undermine her authority. But she'd built her reputation on pragmatism, on using whatever resources advanced Kryll interests. And right now, she needed someone who could navigate both human and Kryll systems. Someone with no loyalty except to their own conscience. She asked him if he could identify the other conspirators, if he could help her root out the cancer in her command structure without triggering the very coup they feared. Webb nodded, already pulling up schematics of the Kryll flagship, mapping its systems with the familiarity of obsession. He could do more than identify conspirators. He could help her turn the trap back on its architects. But it would require access to her ship, to her networks, to the heart of the Dominion's military infrastructure. It would require trust from an alien species that defined itself through conquest, offered by a human who'd been exiled for exactly this kind of collaboration. They worked through the night or what passed. For night on a station without circadian rhythms, planning their approach with a careful detail of surgeons. Webb showed Virexxa how to isolate the compromised communication channels, how to feed false data to the conspirators while monitoring their responses. He explained that the nanoplague in her armor could be repurposed, turned into a tracking mechanism that would light up anyone carrying similar infiltration tools. The Queen contributed her own knowledge of Kryll politics, identifying which advisors might be salvageable and which were certainly compromised. She described the intricate web of alliances and obligations that governed her court, the delicate balance between her authority and the collective will of the warrior caste. Together, they constructed a strategy that was part military operation, part political theater. They would let the conspiracy think it was succeeding, allow the tension to build until the traitors were forced to act overtly. Then, at the moment of maximum exposure, they would strike. As the planning session stretched into its 6th hour, something unexpected happened. They began to talk about things beyond the immediate crisis, about their respective exiles, about the loneliness of seeing truths that others refused to acknowledge. Virexxa admitted that her military successes had isolated her as completely as Webb's skills had isolated him. She couldn't show doubt without appearing weak, couldn't question the war's direction without seeming defeatist. The armor that made her powerful also trapped her in a role she wasn't certain she still believed in. Webb described his own trap: the realization that understanding the enemy made you suspect your own people, that empathy in wartime was indistinguishable from treason. They were, in their different ways, prisoners of the same conflict. The conversation revealed fault lines in the war that neither species acknowledged publicly: the exhaustion, the resource depletion, the growing sense that victory was becoming indistinguishable from mutual annihilation. These were truths spoken only in exile or in the privacy of command chambers, never in official communications or public discourse. The plan crystallized over the following weeks, as Webb integrated himself into the shadow operations of Virexxa's counterintelligence efforts. He worked remotely at first, routing his systems through secure quantum channels, but eventually circumstances demanded his physical presence. The Queen arranged for his transport under false credentials, listed as a captured human technician, being brought aboard for interrogation. The ruse was thin but sufficient. Once aboard the flagship, Webb operated from a secured lab deep in the engineering section, surrounded by Kryll technology that sang to him in frequencies his augmented senses could barely process. He met some of Virexxa's loyalist officers, who'd begun to suspect the conspiracy, but lacked proof. Their reaction to a human in their midst ranged from hostility to cautious curiosity, but Virexxa's endorsement was absolute. She made it clear that Webb was under her personal protection, that any move against him would be interpreted as an act against her authority. It was a dangerous gambit, but it held. The conspiracy unraveled exactly as they'd predicted, with a crescendo of hubris and desperation. The traitors, believing the Queen's armor was still compromised, accelerated their timeline. They planned to strike during a critical battle with human forces, where her failure could be attributed to enemy action. But Webb and Virexxa had spent weeks preparing for this moment. When the conspirators activated their final protocols, every compromised system lit up across the network simultaneously. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, and Virexxa moved with the precision of a surgeon excising diseased tissue. The arrests happened within hours, the tribunals within days. The coup collapsed before it could materialize, and the Queen's authority emerged stronger than before, despite her use of a human advisor. But because of it, she demonstrated the very trait that separated good commanders from great ones: the ability to use any resource, even improbable ones, to protect her people. The message resonated through the Dominion's military hierarchy. Virexxa wasn't weakened by pragmatism, she was empowered by it. In the aftermath, as the flagship prepared for its next deployment, Virexxa summoned Webb to her private chambers, a space he'd never expected to see, filled with artifacts from conquered worlds and personal trophies that spoke to centuries of military tradition. She stood before him without her armor for the first time, her natural form smaller than her armored silhouette, but no less imposing. She told him that he'd earned a choice: return to his exile with her gratitude and enough resources to live comfortably, or stay on as a permanent advisor. The role would be unofficial, deniable if necessary, but real. There would be assignments, challenges, probably danger. But he wouldn't be alone anymore, wouldn't be relegated to the margins while the galaxy burned. Webb considered the offer with the same methodical analysis he applied to technical problems. Staying meant permanent betrayal in human eyes, meant accepting that he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. But the exile had already established that betrayal. At least here, in this impossible position, he might accomplish something beyond survival. He accepted. They stood together at the observation deck as the flagship prepared for departure, gazing out at the wormhole forming in space, ahead a tunnel through reality that would carry them toward the next crisis, the next impossible problem. Virexxa turned to Webb with an expression that might have been the Kryll equivalent of amusement. She told him that he wasn't what she'd expected when she'd set out to find the saboteur who'd dared touch her armor. She'd expected a spy, a provocateur, maybe a fanatic. Instead, she'd found someone as trapped by the war as she was. Someone willing to risk everything for the slim possibility of a different outcome. Webb smiled, a tired expression that didn't quite reach his augmented eyes. He told her that expectations were dangerous things in wartime, that the moment you stopped being surprised by your enemy was the moment you stopped understanding them. Virexxa's mandibles clicked in what he'd learned was approval, and they watched in silence as the wormhole stabilized and the ship began its transit. Behind them, the conspiracy had been neutralized. Ahead of them, the war continued. But in the space between, in the unlikely alliance of an exiled human and an alien queen, something new had taken root. Not peace, not yet, but the possibility of it.